Good afternoon. As I said, we are going to go ahead and get started. We do know we have others coming, but we have another panel, so I don't want to hold this panel as we go forward. So those of you who are here on time will get the benefit of all of the information. And those that come later, we'll make sure that we can get them caught up as best we can. So good afternoon again. I'm Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, and welcome to this year's Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Voting Rights Braintrust. This year's topic is A Different World, Exerting Power to Effect Change. I want to begin by recognizing the moderator. Jonathan Capehart has stepped in, and I am so excited about the fact that he's here. I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of years ago. He did a retreat for the Congressional Black Caucus. I think he's an exceptional commentator, writer. He is one of our best and our brightest, and I'm so happy that you are here. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to see the faces that I normally see and to see some new faces this year, so thank you for being here as well. Today we are going to talk about the America that prides itself on being a beacon of freedom and democracy. Yet the issues that we will discuss today shine a light on a hard truth, that freedoms and the right of all Americans to participate in this democracy are under siege in this country. There are few things more sacred in our democracy than the right to vote. Yet voting rights are constantly under attack as states across the country pass voter suppression laws. These laws purposefully, and disproportionately affect people of color. Rather than investigating unconstitutional voter suppression laws, we have a national commission investigating non-existing voter fraud. This is already resulting in voter suppression and depression as people remove themselves from the rolls out of fear that the commission will gain access to their personal information. The commission asked states to turn over large amounts of voter information such as names, addresses, dates of birth, party registration, last four digits of their social security number, voting history, and felony convictions, and more. This is truly a different world. 2018 is rapidly approaching, and we must do all we can to protect the right of every citizen to cast their ballot. Our first panel again is going to be moderated by the Washington Post's Jonathan Capehart. We will discuss the state of voter suppression and how we can fight back. We as well have with us Stacy Adams, who is a candidate for governor of the state of Georgia. We have Nicole Austin Hillary, Esquire, Director and Counsel, Washington, D.C. office of the Brennan Center for Justice, and Derek Johnson, who is the interim president and CEO of the NAACP. Discriminatory state laws are not the only form of voter suppression. Redistricting affects our political power and is key to the electoral process. It can determine which party controls Congress and state and local governments across the country. Partisan redistricting, more times than not, dilutes minority voting strength by dividing urban centers. So let us move forward, and we will turn it over to Jonathan. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Fudge, for your very kind words and your introduction. Thank you also to the Congressional Black Caucus for putting this panel on. And I want to especially thank the original moderator, Joy Reid, whose popularity at MSNBC as an anchor required her to find a replacement. So I am always happy to try to fill Joy Reid's shoes. The Congresswoman briefly introduced the panelists, but I'm going to go down and read a little bit more. You can read their full bios in your program book. Stacy Adams, she was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 2006, and in 2010 became the first woman to lead in the Georgia General Assembly and the first African American to lead in the Georgia House. She is you are still House Minority Leader.
Actually, former now.
Former House Minority Leader, and perhaps first African American woman governor of Georgia.
So first black woman to be governor in the history of the United States, but the first black governor of Georgia.
I was going to get to that part.
Sorry.
But an historic figure.
You do a great lead-in. I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's all right. Nicole Austin Hillary is the first director and counsel of the Brennan Center for Justice, Washington, D.C. office. Her priority issues include voting rights, racial and criminal justice advocacy and reform, indigent defense, and vote restoration. And last but not least, Derek Johnson is the interim president and CEO of the NAACP. Mr. Johnson previously served as vice chairman of the NAACP National Board of Directors and state president for the NAACP Mississippi Conference. Thank you all very much for being here. Yes.
Listen, I know it's hard to see on this end, so could you move to this side?
Oh yeah, there are a lot of seats over here.
Lots of seats over
Lots
here.
of
Come on,
seats.
everybody. Let's come on. Let's everybody move toward these two center sections.
All right, and while you're moving over, in the interest of moving the panel along, because there's another panel after this one, just to throw out a general question here, and this is a layup. So President Trump signed an executive order creating the so-called Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, and the Congresswoman laid out some of the concerns that are there as a result of this commission. But I would like for each of you to talk about how you view this commission, what your concerns are, and what do you see as a remedy to anything that the commission could possibly come up with. I'll start with you, is it Assemblywoman?
That works.
Okay.
Stacy is also good.
Okay.
No, first I want to say thank you. He has been a very good sport sitting next to me for the last 7 minutes. But Jonathan Capehart is just an extraordinary writer who has just been telling the truth for so long, and I just want to say thank you again for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
So I sit in Georgia, and we are one of the states that almost immediately agreed to participate in the sham Integrity Commission. The argument made by our Secretary of State was that it was necessary for the protection of the right to vote. And it relies on what has been a 20-year creation of this false logic of voter suppression. By grounding it in questions of integrity, using the language of access, using the language of protection, this group of people who are trying their best, led by the occupant of the White House, to undermine voting in the United States. They use this false logic that they are somehow protecting our right to vote while they very, very effectively try to eradicate it. And I think more than anything on the state level, this is a critical issue because for states, it's not simply what happens on the national level, it's what happens at your school board. It's what happens in your county commission and your city councils. It's whether or not the right to vote is actually valued and protected. And to have such a sham come out of the White House gives onus and gives lift to, unfortunately, people like the Secretary of State of Georgia, who models himself as a mini Trump and sees it as his mission to attack the right to vote. And I can go into this later, but just yesterday, I was exonerated. I've been under investigation for 2.5 years by the Secretary of State because I had the temerity to register 86,000 people of color in the state of Georgia. Thank you. After a very protracted and unnecessary investigation, because we turned in forms that by law had to be turned in, they announced the stunning result that 53 forms out of 87,000 might have been fraudulent. And we knew that, and we told them that. But they have taken all of this time, and now they're going to pursue legal attacks against a bunch of 25-year-olds whose only mistake was just being young and stupid. They didn't try to commit some higher level of voter fraud. But by turning these young people into criminals, they further erode the trust that we have in our system, and that's fundamentally the problem I have. When you erode trust in a system, you create the space for those rights to be taken away, and that's the worry I have about what's happening with that commission.
Nicole, what are your views on the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity?
You said that so mellifluously. And I like the way you all, by the way, moved over like in church. You know how sometimes the ministers say, don't hide in the back. I like that, Congresswoman Fudge. First of all, thank you, Congresswoman Fudge, for your leadership and for convening this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. For those of you who do not know, the Brennan Center for Justice is a national think tank legal advocacy organization, and we try to do what we call fix those broken parts of our systems of justice and democracy. And that is fitting because this commission is indeed a semblance of what is broken in our democracy. The Brennan Center has been one of the organizations that has been at the forefront of trying to tell the truth, because we call ourselves truth tellers. We've been trying to tell the truth for a long time about voter fraud. We have done several reports, one namely called The Truth About Voter Fraud, that really has analyzed what people mean when they talk about voter fraud and whether it is something that is really happening across the United States. And what we found in our research is this: that voter fraud is something that happens rarely. That in fact, and you've probably heard this quote, it comes from our report, that you are more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to encounter voter fraud. That is the truth. And what we have found is that there are individuals from certain political spectrums who want to use this idea, this concept of voter fraud, to really try to sham the American public, to try to make them believe that we have problems in our voting systems that do not exist, so that they won't pay attention to the problems that actually exist, that I know, Jonathan, we're going to get to talk about. Problems dealing with registration, problems dealing with long lines, problems dealing with citizenship issues and people being asked to provide IDs when those are unnecessary. And that is our concern about this commission, that it is taking away precious time and attention from the real voting issues that we need to be concerned about in this country. But here's my hope. My hope is this, that the fact that this commission is going on, and every time they hold a hearing or a meeting, which they just did in New Hampshire on September 12th, we see information come out that shows people that there is doubt about their true focus and about what they are really trying to get at. We also see evidence of infighting even within the commission itself among some of the commissioners. So oftentimes we have to realize that even when something is occurring that we may not be pleased about, like the formation of this commission, sometimes it may have the impact of showing us what we really need to be focused on and actually revealing problems with individuals who are trying to tell the American people an untruth about voter fraud. And I will also tell you, if you are interested in really following up on what this commission is doing, if you go to our Brennan Center website, brennancenter.org, we have an entire section on this commission about the formation of the commission, about the kind of data that they're requesting, about the members of the commission, and about the materials that they are pulling together, that they are evaluating, so that you, the American public, will constantly know the truth about voter fraud and know the truth about the work that this commission is doing. So we are concerned about it, but we are watching it very steadily because we think the impact will be that it will help the American people to learn whether voter fraud really does exist, and we contend that it does not.
Derek Johnson, your views on the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Congresswoman Fudge, for having this panel. You know, as you look at the commission, it is not about voter fraud. It's a communication strategy to undermine the confidence of elections in this country as we become a blacker and browner country. See, if you recall the discussion around voter ID, no one is voting under alleged names. In fact, the voter fraud you find are bad actors who are elected officials charged with the responsibility of carrying out elections. But there's a whole body of research that has taken place since the early 70s, Cato Institute, Heritage, and other think tanks that have been tracking demographic trends. And as a result of that, they understand that very soon, particularly in the Southeast and the Southwest, that the majority of the elected officials or those who are the electorate won't look like the America that many people want it to look like. And so to justify drastic changes in our voting laws, they developed a communication strategy. So we had chased the outcome of a commission's finding, not understanding that the goal is to control the narrative around voting. For us, the solution is 2018 midterm elections. For us, the solution is stop chasing that narrative and start looking at how do we establish a stronger, proactive narrative that opens up democracy. Voting is the tool to democracy. Democracy is the ability to control the tax revenue. Who gets taxed, who's not taxed, and what the tax dollars are spent on. Elected officials who can't read budgets shouldn't be elected officials. That's why I'm glad Stacy's running for governor. She's a good Mississippian, although she's in Georgia. She knows how to read a budget, because the value of any political body is based in where the money is being spent, and the control of that money has always been the true impetus behind the conversation in this country. So the solution is in 2018 midterm elections. What are we going to do about that?
So in an interview on my podcast, K-Pub, Sherilyn Eiffel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, when I asked her about this commission, she said, well, you know, Jonathan, we don't have a problem of too many people voting. We have a problem of too few people voting. And so I would like to ask any of you, all of you don't have to answer this, but Nicole, you brought up, you know, some of the things that have to do with the problem of voting, but what were some of the overt and covert suppression efforts during the 2016 presidential campaign, or even at the state level, that keeps people from exercising their constitutional right to vote?
No, go ahead, Derek.
I like talking from a surplus point of view. You look at the trend during presidential elections, black folks' trend of voting has gone up over the last 20 years, not down. We have a problem with not voting during the right time, local and midterm elections. If we have presidential level turnout in most elections, during midterm elections, the dynamics of Congress will look completely different. And so for us, thinking from a surplus frame, what should we be doing as civil rights organizations at CBC, or CBC Institute, I should say, to try to identify those infrequent voters so they can go turn out next year? That's where the opportunity lies. If we reinforce the debate around vote suppression and not enough people voting, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we need to talk about and commend people for voting and highlight successes so we can replicate those successes where they exist, and not always talk about the negative. You know, black folks don't vote. That's not true. Black folks do vote in some areas. We voted a higher percentage during presidential elections than our white counterpart. The question is, can we get black folks to vote when we most need them, state and local elections?
Wait, let me challenge you on that, though, Derek. I mean, you even just said in the midterm elections, black voters don't come out to vote. And that, I mean, I understand the state and local elections, absolutely. But 2018 is coming, and we saw what happened in 2010 and 2014. How do you convince the electorate that knows it's important to show up during the presidential election year that it is actually even more important to show up in the midterm election year?
So why don't we look at 2006 election when we did have an increase and we changed everything as opposed to going to the negative? So let me look at my state, the beautiful state of Mississippi. We don't have racism down there. I don't know if y'all heard about that. We presidential elections, 63% of African Americans voted last year. 52% of white folks voted. We represent just under 35% of voting age population, yet we cast 40% of the ballots. Our problem is during midterm or state elections, we drop down to around 34%. They drop down about 40%. Is more than us. So we got to figure out how our drop-off is not so strong. That's the challenge of civil rights organizations. That's our real mission. We can't chase marches. We got to chase voters and get them to vote when we need them to vote.
As someone who's run for office, in elective office, running for governor, you got an answer for me?
I do. Okay, so raise your hand if you buy RC Cola. Raise your hand if you buy Coke. How many of you have seen an RC Cola commercial ever? How many of you have seen a Coke commercial? We spend billions of dollars on the presidential election. We spend billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of man-hours on the ground in presidential elections. We spend nothing on state elections. We spend almost nothing on gubernatorial elections. Congressional elections, and Congresswoman Fudge did an extraordinary job in 2014, trying her best to make certain people understood what congressional elections meant. The problem is you cannot do it alone. You cannot do it in a silo. We have an entire industry that has been designed to make certain that Americans understand what the president does. Most people have a vague idea what the governor does and no idea what a state legislator does. And so the challenge is that the investment in midterm elections does not look like the investment in presidential elections. The corollary to that, though, is that it's the candidate's responsibility to be part of the narrative. And particularly in the South, our candidates for statewide office spend most of their time trying to convince people who disagree with us ideologically, trying to convince them that they really want to come back to us. Race is the strongest predictor of voting patterns in America. And if you are a person of color, you are unlikely to be a conservative. It happens. We don't know what happens genetically, but it happens. But the reality is we spend an inordinate amount of progressive dollars trying to convince conservatives that they really meant to be Democrats. Basically, it's the moral equivalent of trying to convince an atheist he wants to be a Catholic. We spend no money trying to get Baptists to go to church. That is how we win elections. And so you can't turn out those voters if you aren't investing in those voters. We know money works. We know that if RC Cola had the budget of Coca-Cola, they probably could get more folks in this room to raise their hands. But when you don't have the budget to communicate, or when your only communication is with someone who's told you, I drink only Pepsi, you're never going to have Coke buyers. And so we have to treat our state and local elections, our midterm elections, as valuable and as valid as our federal elections. Because what really does happen is that most people of color understand the federal government. Most of us who live in states where our rights are suppressed, it happens at the state level. We knew that it was the federal government that let us be free. We have not had that conversation on the state level, and so until you have candidates who are willing to speak truth to power, until you have investment that is actually focused on our communities and not being siphoned off to invest only in people who've told you again and again, I don't want you, then we will not win those elections. But I do push back on this fundamental narrative that people of color just don't want to vote in midterms. We aren't treated like valuable voters in midterms. That is why we don't vote.
Nicole, I want to allow you to reclaim your time since you were kind enough to let Derek jump in on that pushback of mine. Go ahead.
That's okay. And Jonathan, I'm going to give you a twofer. I'm going to answer your original question posed, and then I'm also going to answer your counter that you posed to Derek. Number one, folks need to understand that the biggest thing that is happening, that happened in 2016, that helped to make it harder for people to engage in our electoral process, is that the people who want to keep certain people from voting kept the pressure on. They did not retreat. If you look at what state legislatures have continued to do across this country, they have continuously, during their legislative sessions, introduced bills that would make it harder for Black, brown people, for women, for students, and poor and elderly people to vote. They continue to introduce bills that would require voter ID, in-person ID at the polls. They continue to make changes to registration requirements. And they also, and this is one of the biggest things that we have to focus on, they continue to put out misinformation. One of the biggest problems that we have is that people don't necessarily know what they need to know about Election Day. We still, on Election Day, many of us work on the election protection hotline. We still, on Election Day, get calls from people who are at one precinct when they should be at another. That is about misinformation. So one of the things that we have to do as a community of progressive people who care about our democracy is ensure that we are teaching and arming people with information. There is nothing more dangerous than smart, educated people. And that is one of the ways that we are going to be able to combat the efforts to suppress the vote. And then, Jonathan, when you talk about who votes and getting people out to the polls, and I agree with my friend and colleague Sherilyn Ifill. I tell people all the time when I'm giving talks about voting, as scary as voter suppression is, the scariest problem we have in the United States is that people are not coming out to vote. That is the biggest problem we have. If we could get everyone in this country who is eligible to be registered to vote at the polls, it would be astronomical. The lines, the issues that we would be dealing with, everybody would have a voice. So that is one of our biggest problems. And the way in which we deal with that problem and help to address the suppression issues is to try and pass legislative reforms that make it easier for people to vote. Reforms like automatic voter registration. They just passed it in Illinois, and it was bipartisan. Automatic voter registration is one of those mechanisms that ensures that when you go to register to vote, or I'm sorry, when you go to a social services office or your DMV office, wherever you live, they're going to ask you if you'd like to register to vote. And if you say yes, they're going to register you automatically. And that registration is going to follow you throughout your lifetime in that state. Whether you move from Maple Street to Apple Way, it's going to follow you. Whether you change your name from Smith or marry somebody and get a hyphenated name like mine, it's going to follow you. So those are the kinds of things we need to be focused on. Yes, as Stacy said, you have to focus on getting voters out, but you also have to ensure that we are getting reforms and measures in place that put the onus on the state and make the states ensure that it is easier and more accessible for people to actually vote and to actually register and keep their registrations update. That is how we are going to fight back against suppression, and that is how we are going to ensure that every American has a voice at the polls on Election Day.
I'm going to ask two questions, and then we have a microphone. Sorry, I stepped all over your applause. Sorry there, Nicole. But there's a microphone set up here in the center of the room. I'm going to ask two more questions and then open it up to questions from the audience. And I'm going to say it now, and then I'm going to say it later. Make sure they are questions and that they are short. And if they become speeches, I don't mean to be rude, but I'll cut you off, and I'll be rude. So you mentioned some of the voter suppression efforts focused on young people and the elderly. What can specifically be done to help seniors and college students exercise their right to vote?
Well, one of the biggest things that we can do to help them, again, is to, in your communities, work with your community organizations. Ensure that when material information is published to give people the information they need about registration and about Election Day voting in their state, that they have that. Organizations like the Brennan Center, our other brother-sister organizations, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, LDF, the ACLU, all of our organizations work tirelessly on these issues, and we do a lot of research and put out a lot of information. And we don't do it just so we can look smart. We do it because we want to arm you all and your communities with the right information. That's one of the things that can be done. The other thing that can be done is, as Stacy said, you have to get engaged in local politics. These bills that are being introduced, they're not being introduced in Congress up the street. They're being introduced in state legislatures across the country. You have to know what bills are being introduced. You have to know when the legislative session starts and ends in your state. You have to know what you can do to lobby those members and who those leaders are. The other thing that you can do is this. In terms of students in particular, there are many organizations like Rock the Vote, for instance, that put out information directed just to students to let them know what the rules and regulations are, where they live, regarding student voting, regarding IDs, regarding whether they can use their student ID to register, or whether they have to use something else, or whether they have to register where they live and where their parents are. So getting that information and communicating in your civic associations, in your churches, that's what has to be done. I know we like to do bake sales and have fashion shows and all of that is cute and good. But when you have the bake sale and fashion show, slip something else in there, like information about voter registration, information about automatic registration, information about what students need to know, what kind of ID they need. Arm people with that information. That's going to be one of our biggest weapons, Jonathan.
The final question, I'll direct it to a legislator and a candidate, and to the man leading you guys are still the largest civil rights organization in the country, aren't you? Okay, just one double check. How do you fight not voter apathy, but voter weariness, that the battles that are being fought are so many with very little very, very little hope that success will be ours. How do you keep that activism that we see out in the streets since the inauguration of Donald Trump? How do you get them to focus that energy on this issue and keep pushing, as Nicole was saying, that the other side is doing? I'll start with you, Stacey.
I think the first reality is that the one unintended consequence of the abomination of November 9th was that you have seen a galvanizing force, that people who were weary realized there's actually a consequence. And we've been talking about the consequence of elections for as long as I've been alive, and I grew up in Mississippi with Derek. I've always heard this is the most important election. We never believed it till we saw what could happen. And so I've actually not seen weariness. I've seen wariness. I've seen people who are suspicious of everyone else now because they want to make sure that we get it right the next time. But that's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for two things. I talk about elections in this way. I talk about politicians in this way. We are hired to do a job. It is the only job where you can get hired and not have anybody review your job performance for 2 years or 4 years, or if you're a senator for 6 years, and where your bosses really don't have a high standard for your success. They just don't want you to steal too much. They don't necessarily hold you accountable for delivery all the time. And you have some folks who do a fantastic job, the CBC members, people who work hard no matter what, even though they are in likely positions they won't have to fight as hard. But the other piece is that politicians respond to three things. We're like 15-year-old girls. We respond to money, peer pressure, and attention. Those are the three levers. And the opportunity that citizens have is to understand which of those levers they can pull. And so one of the ways you counteract the overwhelming amount of just terrible information that comes out of DC every single day is by helping people focus on the local issues, helping people focus on what's happening in front of them, because they can't stop taunting somebody from taunting North Korea, but they can stop someone from putting a landfill in their neighborhood. They cannot stop the abominations that keep coming out of the White House, but they can make certain that there's a road in their community that finally gets paved. And so it's having the responsibility, especially holding your legislators accountable for localizing the conversation so that people actually see what happens. Because I don't believe in voter apathy. I believe that voters have been disappointed, and that disappointment turns to cynicism, and they like to pretend that they're apathetic. They're not apathetic. They care. They just don't know how to do. And I think that's why what Nicole talks about is so important, and it's why what Derek does is so critical. We have to hold legislators accountable at every level of government for actually delivering on their promises and delivering their services. But they also have to run campaigns where they talk not about themselves, but about how they can help. That's how we change the engagement level, because people are primed. Democrats, and I know this is nonpartisan, I don't have that problem. Democrats have overperformed in every single special election this year, without exception. Right. That overperformance proves that we are not weary. But what we have to have is a higher level of engagement, and that goes to Derek's point and to Nicole's point. There are enough of us. Georgia is a blue state. We're just really confused. Because we are a state that has 53% white, non-Hispanic, 47% people of color. You have a 23% white population that votes Democratic no matter what. We don't win because we don't turn out voters of color. That's our only problem. You could control the deep South if we could fully maximize our votes, and that's why I'm running for office. But that's not just about me. That's about every state we're from. And so I think the way we push back, again, and it goes to the narratives. The narrative of weariness, of voter fatigue, is put out there so that we stop voting, or that we just get tired of it. We have to believe in voter relentlessness. That's what I preach, and that's what I work towards.
So just like a Baptist preacher's 3 points: validators, machinery, our message, not theirs. Validators. We have to create scenarios where, like when my wife go to Kroger's on I-55, on election day, the guy who's the butcher, the woman who stocked the shelf, they're going to ask her who we're voting for. They're looking for, she's their validator. We need more validators who operate with integrity, so that when people go to vote, they don't get so bad candidates, be them black or white, right? Machinery, we have lost black machineries all across the country. There's no reason why Detroit, 80% black, would have a white mayor. The black political machine imploded. Stacey had to build the machine in Georgia, and while our folks fought her in doing that, and she's the only one that registered 86,000 people. Now she have a machine. Alabama had one of the most effective political machines around, and it imploded. California got the last semblance of machine with 7% of the state's population that's still able to elect folks statewide. But we've lost our political machine. And so we have to rebuild and replenish our political machinery. One of the things we've done is created a leadership institute in the 6th year, and we run candidates, and we get folks to provide professional support for those candidates. We have to do that in every community. Our message, not their message. We got to stop allowing the tail to wag the dog. The Democratic Party allow a group of consultants to consume all their money to build out a message for our community. That's not a winning strategy. If we had strong machineries, we can reject that so that we can turn our folks out with the right validators, so no matter win, lose, or draw, if we fight, we win. But far too often, we don't have the right validators plugged into the right machines, giving our message so that people don't get discouraged, win, lose, or draw, because they're in the fight.
Thank you very much, Derek. Congresswoman Fudge.
I know it's time for questions. I do want to recognize my colleague Stacey Plaskett from the Virgin Islands, who has joined us. Let's keep the islands in our prayers. St. Croix was hit very hard this week, and St. Thomas last week. So Stacey has really been working day and night. So we thank you, Stacey. My good friend, Stacey Plaskett. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, and welcome, Congresswoman. All right, I see 4 people lined up at the microphone. This is a time for Q&A. I'm going to repeat what I said before. Keep your questions short. Please, no speeches. If you launch into a speech, I don't want to be rude, but I'll be rude and cut you off. So, sir.
Excuse me. Asa Gordon of Gordon versus the National Archives and Record Administration. I filed a civil action over the 2016 election that included 11 states, that includes the state of Georgia, that award their electors on a winner-take-all basis. You may not be aware, but in those states, there is no election code that says that the candidate wins the popular vote, wins all electors of the state. So I said that they must award them in proportion to the popular vote split, or be subject to a provision of the Constitution that's not been enforced since Reconstruction.
And your question, sir.
The second section of the 14th Amendment, which demands that those states reduce their representation in Congress for the disfranchisement of its African, that population. In Brennan Center Taxpayer Voter ID Act, if the documentation is good enough to take my money, it's good enough to take my vote, automatic registration for all citizens that file a federal income tax. No photo ID required to take my money, no photo ID required to take my vote.
And with
The question is...
okay.
Oh,
okay. No.
The question was, Stacy Adams, I believe you were a presidential elector.
I was.
For Georgia. If you had demand to be voted on the state when the electors met in Georgia, the Secretary of State had no statute that they could point to say that you could not cast your vote, and you would have gotten 7 presidential elected on proportional basis from the state of Georgia.
Thank you.
Question. No.
When you vote
No. This is not third time's a charm. Young lady in the green dress.
Hello. First of all, I just want to say thank you. This is a great panel. My last name is Higginbotham, so I had to be here. My cousin Pete is over there. He's Higginbotham too, and that was a statement. Yeah. But I want to say my major hats off to you, Miss Adams, because
Abrams.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The shoes are Adams. I'm Abrams.
Forgive me.
You're
fine. The question that I have is twofold. One, and Congresswoman Fudge as well. why do we concede the South? Because it's full of black folks and, you know, even poor white people who I think have common interests. So I don't understand when the Democratic Party just says, you know, we're not going down South. Yeah, go down there. So they're getting one message. So kudos. And what else is happening around the country? Maybe you guys can answer it, where people are doing the same. And the other part of the question is, why are we ignoring the black woman vote? We hear all this talk about Latino vote. The Latino vote means nothing if black people stay home. And black women who voted 96% for, you know, somebody other than Trump in this last election, if we don't show up, there is no winning. So what kinds of things are happening to engage black women and poor people in the South?
Right.
Do you want to go first?
Jump in.
Well, to engage the South, very little to nothing. That is why we have to rebuild our black political machinery. We can't rely on others to do what we need to do, but also understand that political parties are nothing more than vehicles for agendas. We have to have a stronger standing within the party to advance an agenda about the South. For us, we don't segment women versus men as voters, because in our organizations, the women, like the church, they run everything anyway, so no need to segment it off, because we recognize what the reality is.
So I would say two things. I think the first piece, candidates often drive the tenor of an election, and particularly in the South, because we do not often get federal support. We don't get national support for our elections. And so often the amount of money you have determines the direction of your campaign. And so I agree with you. I've spent, and Congresswoman Fudge can tell you, I spend a lot of time up here in DC, I spend a lot of time in New York begging people to pay attention to the South. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Until we win, they won't invest, and they won't invest until we win. And they keep waiting for this tipping point where suddenly it's majority black or majority people of color. The reality is that's not the formula for success. People of color, especially black people, we understand coalition building. That is how we have always been successful. And so my belief is that we have to have candidates who unabashedly talk about the victories that we can find in the South, particularly in Georgia, particularly May 22nd, 2018 and November 2018, but that the conversation has to be relentlessly about how we center people of color in our campaigns. The reason we don't have those investments is that we keep chasing a lost legacy of voters, and we have replaced them already. They are black women, they are black men, they are Latino women and men. And to your second part, I very strongly agree. I think black women will save the South, and I'm trying to be a part of that. So.
Right. Thank you.
Jonathan,
Go ahead, Nicole.
I just want to offer a footnote to your question, which is this. The Brennan Center does not engage in trying to get voters out to the polls. That's not what we do. But I will say this, and this is something that folks need to pay attention to, and I think the second panel for Congresswoman Fudge's Braintrust is going to focus on this. Redistricting. Let me say that again. Redistricting. If you want to talk about bringing power back to certain jurisdictions in certain states, folks have got to pay attention to redistricting. I know it's a funny sounding word and we see these funny shaped maps, but folks need to understand there's a major Supreme Court case coming up on redistricting. And again, when you heard Stacy talk about paying attention to locals, it is electing those local Congress people, your state assembly people, your state senators. Those are the people who draw those maps. So when you want to talk about bringing power back to certain people in those jurisdictions, you must pay attention to redistricting. I don't want folks to fall asleep on that. I'll say it one last time, redistricting.
All right, Nicole, thank you. So here's what we're going to do, because we've got less than 10 minutes and we want to get all of your questions in. Yep, including you. So what we'll do is ask your very brief question in succession, and then they will all pay attention and respond in kind. And then to the people who are standing there in the back, there's a whole lot of seats over there and some here in the front in this section here near the microphone. Don't be shy, because there's also another panel. You'll be standing a long time. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, my name is Nal Abdurrahman. I'm from Howard University here, and I also am from Georgia too. So,
Question.
I just want to talk about the John Ossoff campaign, one that could have actually really, I don't know if it's winnable or not, but that's kind of my question. Do you think voter suppression played a role in it? And also, do you think the John Ossoff campaign did their absolute best on increasing voter turnout as well?
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Mildred Hodgson, and I'm the president of Central Long Island NAACP, and I have more of a statement, and what I haven't heard is that ex-felons are allowed to vote, and this is something that people haven't been talking about. I've been doing voters registration for over 30 years, and this past election, I registered quite a few ex-felons. Not only that, but I went to all the barber shops and all the hairdressers, and I put up the information, and they were very happy to vote, a lot of the ex-felons. Now, this is something that we tend to forget because many people don't know this, and this is extremely important. And this is something that we need to do because this happens a lot in our community that we know, and a lot of them didn't realize that they could vote. So that's what I've been doing, and I know New York and Georgia's won the place. And Miss Adams, I'm coming to Atlanta. My son lives in Atlanta.
Okay.
He's a fire chief down there. I'm coming. I'm going to help you next year.
All right. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Lauren Zayu. I'm a graduate of Spelman College. And my question is actually for Assemblywoman Abrams. So with your RC Cola Coke analogy, I was wondering if you feel like that's more indicative of the priorities of the party or like the political industry campaign.
Oh, okay.
That's a Spelman woman for you.
So how about you take that last question first and answer any of the others if they, especially the ASA.
I think it all kind of comes together. So with ex-offenders, felons, reenfranchisement, Georgia is one of the states that reenfranchises. Not every state does. If you're in Florida, you can't vote. And so part of it is it's a state-by-state decision, but to Nicole's point, we can change it in every state if we control every state. So that's the first thing. The conversation about Jon Ossoff, John did more than anyone has done in recent memory to win an election. But John's district was a 29-point Republican district. It is 75% white, 25% people of color. It is one of the wealthiest districts in the state. It is the most educated district in the nation. It is not the same as the state of Georgia. Right. And so the reality was everyone talks about the $30 million he raised. Republicans spent $33 million to keep a seat that they should have been able to walk into. And so he did a lot more than anyone has done. But no, of course he didn't do everything because there are communities they didn't go into because they had voters that they didn't think would vote. And that goes to the larger point about the RC Cola and Coca-Cola. We sell product to the people we think will buy it. And there's a presumption, particularly in our party, that low-income communities of color are not worth the investment to turn them out to vote. That is our challenge. And it will not change. It's not an industry problem. It's not a party problem. It's an us problem. Right. Because even we talk about it as though we shouldn't go over there, that apartment complex we shouldn't go into. We rank voters. We have fives, which are the ones which are the super voters, five, which are the people we just don't bother. There's a whole study from Stanford University called Unlisted. These are voters who are caught in this unvirtuous cycle. They don't vote because no one asked, and because no one asked, they don't vote. And because they live in communities we don't value, we don't engage them. The industry reinforces it because they don't make money on those voters. You can't target ads to those voters. You have to knock on their doors. You have to talk to them 3 or 4 times because they've been so disappointed by the history of America, they see no reason to vote. And so our opportunity is to engage those voters from the very beginning. That's why I talk about centering a campaign around communities of color, not to the exclusion of anyone, but with the understanding that if we don't center our campaigns around black communities and brown communities, we are going to continue to lose because they are never going to hear from us if we aren't the ones willing to talk to them.
Nicole.
I want to speak to the question about restoring the right to vote to the formerly incarcerated. A couple things we need to pay attention to is this. Everyone needs to understand that the fact that there are people in this country who do not have their right to vote restored because of their past criminal histories is all intertwined with race. You cannot understand that issue if you do not understand that premise. We wrote a report at the Brennan Center that talks about that history. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about that history. So understand when you are trying to fight that battle, understand that is the foundation of it. The other thing we have to recognize is this, and Stacy alluded to this. Restoring the right to vote to the formerly incarcerated is a state-by-state battle. Every state has different rules and regulations regarding the restoration of the right to vote. And you have to pay attention to what the rules are in your state. You also have to recognize that, again, electing officials who think the way you do is about the power of the vote and is how you are going to make changes. Governor Terry McAuliffe in Virginia is one of those elected officials who showed a great deal of courage. Virginia was one of the states that had one of the most draconian laws on the books regarding the formerly incarcerated and their right to vote. But he decided to use his executive power to say, I am going to restore that right to thousands of formerly incarcerated people. So you have to understand that there has to be a multi-pronged approach to dealing with this issue. And we cannot leave out Congress. Courageous leaders in Congress, like Congresswoman Fudge, have been working very hard to have Congress lead on this issue. The Democracy Restoration Act has been introduced in this session and in previous sessions in both the Senate and the House by Senators Ben Cardin from Maryland and the Honorable John Conyers of Michigan. And they have introduced this bill because it would ensure that with respect to federal elections, and person who was formerly incarcerated would have their right to vote immediately when they're done with that incarcerated period. Regardless of if they owe fees and fines, regardless of if they still have probation and parole issues, it would be restored. If we could get that passed in Congress, guess what? States are not going to want to have dual systems of voting. They are going to follow. It will have a domino effect. So we have to understand that we have to deal with what's going on the state level and encourage our leaders in Congress to pass legislation like the Democracy Restoration Act. And the last thing I want to say is this, Jonathan, I'll turn it over to Derek. We have to change the way we talk about issues. You know, if you continue to call people former felons, guess what? That's how people are going to treat them and think about them. So we throw away that term. At the Brennan Center, we call it restoring the right to vote to the formerly incarcerated, because we want these individuals to feel as though they are full citizens, and they are. When you are done with your jail term, you have to be a good citizen, you have to pay taxes, and you're expected to get a job. So why should you not have your right to vote restored? That is one of the privileges of being a full-fledged citizen in the United States. So if we can get that issue, folks talk about who's coming out to the polls and getting the numbers out, if we could make a dent in that issue, it would ensure that we have millions more people voting in the United States, and it would also ensure that this issue of mass incarceration, which this is also connected to, is something that we help put a dent in. So I don't want folks to fall asleep on that.
Derek.
So if we look at the money priorities of a party, we will always lose, because even when they put money in campaigns, they put it in TV, not radio. Black folks move off radio, not TV. Consultants make more money off the TV ads than they do the radio ads. Our most successful campaigns is when we get the candidates to start early enough, we give them the list and they go knock on the doors. Because in most cases, for state and local elections, many voters don't know either candidate, whether you're incumbent or not. So whoever hit the most doors oftentimes win. But changing the narrative. This past election cycle, we had numerous debates, billions of dollars spent, and no true discussion on the Voting Rights Act. No conversation about it. But even talk about the Voting Rights Act in many ways is a limiting conversation, because it was an act that was put in place, at least Section 5, that was supposed to be temporary, that we kept reauthorizing. What if we begin to have a narrative around compulsory voting? Like 200 countries in Australia where you automatically vote, or completely eliminating voter registration. Why do we have voter registration? It is by nature a vote suppression mechanism. What if we talked about removing restrictive polling places? Why should someone get off work, drive past 3-4 precincts before they get to their home precincts to cast a ballot? And why do we have elections on a work day in the middle of the week? Voting is not for voting's sake, it's about democracy. And if we want to open up democracy and make it work for all, we need to change the narrative and go broader than where we started. The Voting Rights Act did not exist before 1965, but it was a concept someone put into place. We need to be talking about more creative, expansive concepts, so that the next presidential season, they're talking about our narrative, and we got to start setting the narrative now. And as a forward-thinking, positive-looking narrative to open up democracy.
And with that, we're going to have to leave it there. Derek Johnson, Nicole, Austin Hillary, and Stacey Abrams. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Jonathan again, and all our panelists. I know we got a whole section. I don't know, y'all can't see over here, but if you want to move, otherwise I'm going to leave y'all alone. Thank you so much for being here. Let me just say one other thing as we bring our next panel up, and I see that they're in the audience, if they would just please come up. Someone asked about the Ossoff race, and Stacy, the other thing is Ossoff wasn't probably the best candidate either. He didn't live in the district. You want to represent me, but you won't live where I live? It's not a good thing. So I think sometimes we lose races because the powers that be don't listen to what we have to say. And that's, if you want to get black people to vote, then you need to talk to black people, which is what they don't do. Jonathan, don't leave. Okay, if the next panel will come up, I'd appreciate it. We can get that one started. And listen, I see some organizations that are represented here today that I just have to actually recognize. I saw Leon Russell with the NAACP, my sister over here from the NCNW. Come on, stand up. She's not listening. I just introduced you. Just stand up, please. Let's see who are some of my other organizations. But anyway, we're going to start this next panel, which I think is going to be very, very exciting as well.
Are you moderating this panel as well?
I'm not. She is.
Do you know if anybody's doing PowerPoint?
Okay, now, just everybody stay put. This is going to be a really, really good one as well. Our second panel is going to be moderated by Democratic strategist and CNN political commentator Simone Sanders. I know you see Simone. Simone tells the truth, I'm telling you now. Yeah, Simone is great. Simone's mother is here. Raise your hand. Listen, I met Simone and was just immediately taken by how bright and articulate she is, and so I'm really happy that she's staying engaged and that she's here with us today. Thank you, Simone. We also have Vanita Gupta, who is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Derek, I think, is going to have to leave us because he has a plane to catch. John Thompson, who is the former director of the U.S. Census Bureau, and Kelly Ward, the executive director of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. We're running behind, so I'm not going to give my whole spiel, but I just want you all to know that the census is extremely important, and they're going to take it from here. All right, let's give Simone a big hand.
I'm going to sit down because we're going to have a family conversation. How are y'all doing today? All right, y'all can do better than that. How are you doing today? Well, today we are going to have a good conversation. I know we just talked about fighting against suppression, and I know you all just had a really engaging conversation, but redistricting is happening right now. Things are happening while we sit in this room, while we organize, while we network, while we strategize, and things are actually happening, and the 2020 census is upon us. And so I have a really great, engaging panel of folks to engage in this family conversation with us, and then we're going to take a few crowd questions. So just give another round of applause for Ms. Vanita Gupta. She is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference. Another round of applause for Mr. John H. Thompson. He's the former director of the U.S. Census Bureau. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Kelly Ward, who is the executive director of NDRC, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Go ahead and clap it up. So I want to jump right in. So my first question is this. So what overt and covert, come on, voting rights suppression tactics did we see during, wait, no, hold on. That's not my, hold on. Well, first of all, what is redistricting? Because I think a lot of times we talk about the fact that redistricting is happening, redrawing, but I mean, what does that actually encompass? So I want to start with the baseline so we are all on the same page. So what is redistricting, Kelly, and how is it going on right now?
Sure. Well, thank you for having us and for having this panel, and Congresswoman Fudge, who continues to be a leader on many issues. Just good to see all of you guys again from my days back in the Hill world. So just the 101 on redistricting that everyone knows, but just to, as Simone said, to get us on the same page. So in the United States Constitution, it is required that we count the country, which is the census. That's what we are going to talk about a lot today. That happens in the 0 year. So in the 10s and the 20s and the 0 zeros, we count the country. Then what happens is the country is then given, each state in the country is given a certain number of congressional seats based on an equal distribution of population. So essentially the total population of the country divided by the 435 House seats. Then what happens is the states have to draw their congressional lines, and then they all have a similar process for their legislative lines to make each congressional district as equal in population distribution as possible. And so that is where the rubber hits the road. So a state after the census is given their total number of congressional seats, and then the local process goes into effect to draw those districts so that each district has an equal population. The kicker on redistricting is that every state's process is different. Every state is different. For the most part, 37 of the 50 states have a basic process where the state legislature draws the line and the governor signs the maps, but even that is different in the states. And just to make it even more complicated, the congressional process and the state legislative line drawing process are often different even within the same state. So how redistricting has to happen every year after the census so that the districts are of equal population, but how it happens is different state by state, and that's where the trickiness comes in.
So, Vanita, one, I want you to tell me, so can you talk about the impact of redistricting and the 2020 census on minority communities? And why should folks care about the 2020 census?
So this is one of these issues where, how many of you in the audience have thought about the census before? I mean, this is a highly engaged, civic participating audience. I will tell you, there are a lot of rooms I'm in where people are like, census? What? And it's not because it's just not kind of considered one of the most pressing civil rights issues, and yet it happens once every 10 years, and the consequences of having an undercount or an unfair count are extremely severe, particularly in communities of color. But let me just explain why the census is important, just to make sure we're all on the same page. It basically affects our nation's ability to ensure equal opportunity and equal representation and equal access to really important governmental and private sector resources for everyone in this country, across racial and ethnic lines. It's used, as Kelly just said, to allocate seats for political representation. In fact, I was in the town hall this morning with Congressman Mark Vesey. His district was created out of the 2010 census that has allowed for greater African American political representation. Just looking at his one example, his example there. It's used to allocate seats and draw district lines for the U.S. House of Representatives, which is how Mark Vesey got his district, for state legislatures, and for local boards. And it's used to target more than $600 billion of federal money to municipalities, to local areas. So it's impacting our schools, it's impacting our healthcare, it's touching almost everything that we do live and breathe every day. But the reality is, though, that African Americans are at great risk of being undercounted. And I would say, I would add immigrant communities especially as well on top of that, Latino and African immigrant communities as well, because of the level of fear that has been ginned up by this administration around reporting anything to the federal government. I wouldn't say it's entirely irrational, but there is a level of fear here that creates a lot more stress and concern for certain communities. But I would just say the African American population has been historically undercounted. And in the 2010 census undercounted African American population by 800,000 individuals in 2010. So we've got a lot of work to do to ensure it breaks down. African American children and African American men between the ages of 18 and 24 also have been historically undercounted. And that has really serious consequences because, as I said, the census really then kind of tracks so much else that comes, so much other money and political representation in our communities.
So the census seems to be extremely important. So, former Director Thompson, one, is the census adequately funded, do you think? And then also tell me, why is adequate funding important for the 2020 census? I mean, literally, it's governing all these parts of our lives. I mean, I'm on television every day, and I don't even hear about the census. So talk to me about this.
Sure. So just so everyone knows, the 2020 census is going to be modernized like no census before, and the idea there is it's going to get away from paper and pencil, which is an error-prone operation, and it'll allow for more accuracy, it'll allow for more targeted resources to communities that need it. So it's a good thing. On the other hand, if you look at, and this is on the Census Bureau website, if you look at the Census Bureau requests for funding since they started planning the 2020 census in 2012, to date, you'll see that they are that the appropriated level of funding is over $200 million below what the Census Bureau has requested.
Pardon me, one more, just so everyone heard that. The appropriated funding is what?
Is $200 million below what the Census Bureau quoted.
$200 million underfunded. Go ahead, Director.
No, that's
200 million.
official.
Million.
It is a lot, but let's talk about a couple other things though. So what the census has done has been to prioritize so they can first deliver on the automation, because if they can't deliver on the automation, then there's going to be a big mess. But the actions they've taken, and this is where it's becoming pretty critical, is they've been deferring certain operations for modernization, and they've been canceling some tests that they could do. But the biggest thing that they've done is they have deferred work, actually probably now into 2019, serious work on building a combined communications and partnership program. And that is essential to getting an accurate census. And when I say partnership and advertising, what it means, it's advertising to reach every audience, not just one audience. So it has to be well-funded and well-planned so it reaches out everywhere. And the other thing is their partnership program, which they actually started in 2000, but the idea there, and it's been working because, while you're right, the undercount is not perfect. It's better than it was before they started this program. And that is that the Census Bureau hires a number of people, and they go work in local communities and local governments to get the word out on two themes. One, and this is tailored locally, why it's important to be counted, what a good count means to you locally. And that varies from community to community, because different communities have different needs, and that's why it's really important to be local. And the other really important message is that the census is confidential. The census does not share data with anyone, not with any enforcement agencies, no one. In fact, the Patriot Act does not supersede the Census Bureau's authority to collect data. They even have the authority to withhold their data from any request that would come under something like the Patriot Act. So, but, you know, that's why the partnership is so important, and especially for this census where there's a lot of fear, because we really need local voices to explain why the data is confidential, so that will be trusted. Because I mean, somebody like me just can't go in a lot of communities and say, oh, trust me, you know, I'm from the government.
So it sounds like, one, everyone's hair should be on fire about the 2020 census. So what are some of the implications if the 2020 census is not adequately funded?
Well, what would happen would be that you would not get an accurate count. And when the census tends to miss people, as we've seen, the census tends to miss minorities more than non-minorities at a much greater rate, and that's what would then transpire. And then, as you've seen, the census permeates everything in terms of allowing access. Funds are allocated, representation's allocated, and even more importantly, and not even more importantly, but even going beyond that, there are a number of different surveys that the government conducts to collect information to allocate various things, and the census data are used to control those surveys. So if the census data is underrepresented, then those surveys that are used to allocate other programs are also underrepresenting the community. So it's a very big deal.
I think that is an understatement. It is, it is absolutely a very big deal. So I would venture to say the census is a civil rights issue. And so, you know what, kudos to Congresswoman Fudge's staff because they wrote that on my piece of paper. But I was going to say it either way because I do believe the census is a civil rights issue. So what can we be doing right now? So from the redistricting committee, what are you all doing in the communities and what can we be doing to assist in these efforts? And also from the leadership conference on civil and human rights standpoint, how are we combating this issue? How are we getting the word out to our communities? And what can we do so that we are, in fact, accurately counted?
Yeah. Well, I think if we had a government that we trusted,
well, come on now, Tim.
right? I mean, if we trusted that the government was a good actor and would protect the information that's given to them and was ready to go launch an accurate, fair count around the country, we would go to town, right? All of us. We would start getting ready to organize our communities. We would be meeting with the census. We would be in partnership. You know, I think as with anything in life, the best kind of organizing comes with trust, right? And as you said, and as Vanita said, and the last panel said, you know, it comes with really knowing the communities on the ground, having those relationships, starting with building that trust. And through those networks, that is when you can have a conversation to say, okay, here's a census document, here's why you should fill it out, trust me that it's safe, it's okay, here's why it's important. Like, you gotta start with those networks of trust like with anything. If we knew we had a government we trusted, we would all get started in those conversations and we would start to leverage our networks that we have on the ground to help the census, right? One of the things that we're starting to see is that at least in the communities in which we work and that we all care about, you know, we are a partisan organization, I realize, but in communities of color, you know, in immigrant communities, in underrepresented communities, in vulnerable communities, there is a real hesitation to start that conversation. There's a real hesitation to leverage those trusted networks to get people to sign the census form and to start to talk about it because there's no, we don't trust the government, right? So for example, a couple weeks ago, y'all I'm sure saw when the DACA controversy was happening, the Justice Department and the White House said that they would use the paperwork that the DACA kids gave that confirmed that they were in fact undocumented, that paperwork could and would now be used against them and would be leveraged to deport them. They confirmed that from the Justice Department. So right there you have this, you know, this trusted exchange of information from citizen to government that in the past has been a trusted relationship is really now in question. So one of the things that we're seeing in communities, and Vanita is even closer to this than we are, is that we have to confirm and build trust with the networks to even start the conversation with voters and citizens that the census is accurate and okay, and that we can have that conversation to actually fill out the paperwork.
But yeah, then, and I want you to answer that question as well, Vanita, but also add on to that, we cannot afford to be left out of this process.
That's right.
We cannot afford not to participate. The stakes are too high.
I mean, what you said, which is the census is a civil rights issue, is it could not be said loud. I mean, I talk about the census as one of our most pressing civil rights issues because if our communities are going to be undercounted, it is going to deny our communities a full voice in the policy-making process in our political system. So we've been talking about voter suppression. This is another vehicle that, and frankly, look, the reality right now is it is on all of us. We do have power and agency to actually make a difference here. It isn't one of the sexiest civil rights issues, but we need to be making it a point of conversation in every church, in every community, in everywhere that we go. There's a couple of things that people need to be doing right now. One is we need to be organizing and asking our members of Congress, and the Congressional Black Caucus is on this. They can be our voices, and we need to be spreading that out, but to support adequate resources for the Census Bureau to conduct the 2020 census. The 2010 census was the most successful in our history, and yet, as I said, 800,000 African Americans were still undercounted or not counted. We could be in a much worse place in 2020 with an administration that has been hostile to our communities on so many fronts.
So point one, the first thing we can do is we need to call our members of Congress to make sure that we tell them that it is important to us that they support adequate resources for the 2020 census?
This is a voting rights issue. It is a civil rights issue. The second thing that the Leadership Conference is working on doing, and we welcome everyone who wants to be engaged into this fight. We are a big coalition. We have a lot of state partners. We need to be working with our state and local leaders about the challenges, especially right now, to the African American and immigrant communities that what they are facing in this upcoming census. We need advocates to join their complete count committees in a lot of jurisdictions around the country. We have a map. We will push that out. Get in touch with us. I'm going to send you an email. I'm going to give you an email address in a second. But there are complete count committees that are going to be established over the course of the next several months in states and localities everywhere around the country, and we need all of you to be a part of them. It's really important that those committees include the voices from the African American community, from immigrant communities, from hard-to-count communities, and historically undercounted communities. Folks need to be involved because those committees are going to work with the Census Bureau and local communities to help ensure an accurate census. And then the other piece now that the Leadership Conference Coalition is feeling particularly, obliged to do is to help fill the gap now because of the partnership, the defunding of the partnership program, which is truly vital. We now need to have our people, our communities, us in those communities as trusted people to educate and work with our communities about what the importance is of being counted. We've got to have a full-on Get Out the Count campaign starting in 2018. We need corporations from Pepsi and Coke to everything else to use their products to educate folks in hard-to-count communities about the purpose of being counted. We need to be organizing those business leaders, and it is something that the coalition is working to do to fill the breach right now of what we are, because we are very concerned. Those in community organizers have been incredibly important to get to hard-to-reach communities, and now it's up to us to fill that breach, and we need as many people engaged in this process as possible.
How many of y'all knew we were in a state of emergency in terms of the 2020 census before this panel? Okay? How many of y'all know now? Every hand should be going up. So, because we're gonna take some crowd questions, but other than redistricting, what kind of impacts could an inaccurate 2020, census count have on minority communities?
Well, I think I
Former director.
No.
And could I just add one thing about our former director, which is that he stepped down in June, and the Census Bureau is still without a director, okay? So while we are all talking about the crisis that we are in and the need to fund this thing, it is also without a leader to direct the Bureau at the moment.
Can I pile on the problem on this? One of the names that's being floated by the Trump administration as a new director, and you probably could speak to this, is someone who has been hostile on voting rights, has testified in court against, in favor of racial gerrymandering and against voting rights, and is not a good actor when it comes.
Who is it? I
don't remember the name. It's not far along, but it was floated as a possible option and in the press as a possible option, which in and of itself is an indication of the potential willingness of the Trump administration to play politics here.
All right, well, former director.
Can I just say this? One of the things about the undercount is, okay, I represent the city of Cleveland. The city is 54% minority. It's 54% black. If we are undercounted, then the resources that the federal government would send to the city are not coming. And so my people who need food stamps or who need WIC or who need social services or safety net services are not going to get them because the money is not coming. It's going to another city whose count is higher. So they do it based upon, so the resources are allocated on a per capita basis. So if they're not counting us, we're not getting our fair share of the money.
That's right.
My goodness. Okay, so, Mr. Director.
Well, I think everybody has said that the census is fundamental to our democracy. It's in the Constitution. It's used for reapportionment. It's used for redistricting. It's used for allocating hundreds of billions of dollars of funds, at least $600 million on an annual basis, $600 billion on an annual basis, and that's probably an underestimate. And on top of that, it really just is fundamental to every government collection operation that collects data on the population and distributes funds on the population. Somewhere in there, a good census really, really matters. So it's very, very fundamental. Just one little thing about the director. I think there is one little silver lining in this cloud, and that is—
Tell us, please.
And that is when the law was changed to make the director position a term, it was put into law that the census director had to have certain abilities. One, they had to understand statistics, and two, they had to have experience in running a large organization. So, and that's in law. So theoretically, and I say theoretically, any nominee would at least should at least meet those criteria.
So basically, what the former director is saying, we probably won't have a Census Bureau director, because I don't know if the current administration knows some folks that meet the criteria. So if the census is so important, why don't we hear more about it? I don't understand why this is not a national conversation. Is it because our communities or our local organizations don't understand the impact that the census has? Why do we not hear more about the census?
Well, I'll just start with that. I mean, I think that we have to make a lot of noise about this. That's why I'm really appreciative that Congresswoman had this. We've got to be out everywhere. I mean, I think one of the dangers is this happens once every 10 years, and so people may hear about it in 2020, but they forget that, okay, it's 2017, that's in 3 years. Well, actually, the work that needs to happen to ensure that there's a fair and accurate count starts years before.
Tell us about that work.
Well, I mean, so the funding piece, right? So in order to ensure that there's $200 million gap, some of us say that it's $300 million there. I think there's a concern.
So let me clarify that.
Yeah.
What I was saying was, to date, they received $200 million less than what they've asked for. What they need now is on top of that $200 million.
That's right.
So it could very easily
We could be $500 million in the hole.
But they're going to need a lot of money at some point, a tremendous amount that they don't have now.
And so we have to have that policy fight right now, because this is when money is getting allocated for the census. And this is a fully digital census, as the former census director said. That has to be tested. As we all know, there are any number of problems. There's a digital divide. There's hacking issues. We've got to make sure that it is secure, that people have confidence in it. And so that money gets allocated right now. And then for the partnership programs that the census director mentioned, we've got to get all those things, that infrastructure has to be in place now. And so the funding fight is right now. And the work that starts, but it's just this sense that, oh, it's in 2 years, it's in 2.5 years, when actually right now is a critical moment for Congress to appropriate the funds that are needed in the hundreds of millions of dollars where there's that gap, in order for us to have the kind of infrastructure that we need to have a fair and accurate count. So we've got to be screaming from the hilltops on this, and I worry that because this is an every 10-year thing, people forget. But the reality is, we are going to live with the consequences of a 2020 census for 10 years. From 2020 to 2030, the 2020 census is going to dictate federal allocation of dollars. It's going to dictate political representation. So we've got to live with those consequences, and that's why we need to be doing as much as possible to be raising the alarm about what's happening right now.
Absolutely. We're going to take some crowd questions. So if you have a question, please, there's a microphone at the center of the room. Please come to the microphone as folks are coming. Vanita said something really interesting earlier. She noted she was on a panel with Congressman Veazey, who said that his district was created thanks to the census. But is it also true that we could also lose districts thanks to the census?
Yep.
Okay, so we could possibly be missing out on representation because we are undercounted.
Right. Can I just say one other thing?
Yes, ma'am. It's your panel.
This week we're talking about the Affordable Care Act. One of the things they want to do is block grant Medicaid to the states. So the resources that come to each state are going to be based upon the numbers of people who were counted in the census. So let's just say that you need Medicaid. If you haven't been counted, somebody's not going to get it. So it affects just about every single thing we fund.
All right, ma'am, please give us your name and what is your question?
Stephanie Turner, and I apologize. I do not have a question. I just wanted to add to what you're saying about census and its impact on everything. And I'm talking about the private industry. So when you're doing marketing studies to see exactly where you're going to put a grocery store or where you're going to put a bank, census data is used for that. So just wanted to add to the whole discussion about how important it is to have an accurate count.
Yes, please.
And, I appreciate that because I think that is why that's going to be kind of an organizing tool for a lot to bring in corporate America into the fight for a fair and accurate count. They have a direct market reason to get invested. Obviously, there's a good government reason, and there's the Constitution, which demands it. But I think that's a really important point that you made because that's why the census goes even beyond all the public goods. The private sector needs to get really invested in ensuring there's a fair and accurate count as well.
Madam.
Hello, everyone. 2 quick questions, Simone. So the first question actually goes to Director Thompson. Could you talk about what we could do to get more of the foot soldiers involved and engaged with sensory advisory committees? Because a lot of people don't know that there are actually community advisory committees for the census, and that those advisory committees go through different nonprofit organizations. They're invited to join, or they can actually write and submit names to join. It actually is filed in the Federal Registry, and it goes through your members of Congress, and they cycle it out. Can you talk about how local folks can get involved in that? And then to Ms. Gupta, could you talk about where do people go to find out about the complete count committees that you referenced earlier? And then 3 questions. Then to everyone, could you kind of give some suggestions around how do we fill that gap of that $200 million that is being undercounted? Well, actually underfunded.
All right. Director Thompson?
Sure. So the Census Bureau has a number of federal advisory committees, and the point there is that they get advice. They are public meetings. They periodically request new members, so that's an opportunity to suggest memberships. The other thing, though, that's really important is the meetings are open to the public.
Oh.
And so the public can submit comments. And so I think that would be a great opportunity to make your voices aware of what's going on. And you don't have to go to Suitland to make your public comment. You're allowed to do that remotely. You can watch it remotely, and you can send comments in. So it's a great opportunity to provide public input.
I love this. Vanita, talk about those count committees.
Yeah.
So where can folks find out about this information?
So the Census Bureau actually on their website, census.gov, has a map of where all those committees are. But what I would like to do is if you are interested in being a part of the work also that the Leadership Conference is doing with state partners and with our coalition members is for you to come up after this panel and sign up, and we'll put you on the listserv and get folks
We'll put you right
engaged.
on the listserv.
But do look at the census, the census website for the map of where you can get engaged with a local complete count.
And that is www.census.gov. So to everyone, for all we know, the Census Bureau is $500 million in the hole. For all we know. It could be more, it could be less. So is there a way for us to close that gap outside of allocated funding from Congress?
Well, I think one of the things that Vanita is saying that is really important is with the cuts to the partnership program, that is where all of us can step in, right? So if that money would have gone to staff to build those partnerships, or to PSA campaigns to raise awareness, or to materials that can be produced to train organizers, like all of us in this room and many more outside of this room have those networks and have those abilities. And so being organized by Vanita and the Leadership Conference, you can see a world where we can almost recreate the partnership network. It's not ideal, certainly, but I think that is, with the cuts to the partnership program, the first thing that's going to go is any level of community outreach, right? And that is, I think, a void that could be stepped in. But again, I think, one of the things that we're running into in the advocacy community and in those networks is people who really need to be reassured that the census can be trusted. And I think, people like Director Thompson and the confidence that you have, the questions that you have, there's a lot of research happening right now on how to fill out the form, what's going to happen on the inside. I think, how can we help give confidence to the advocacy community with leadership from Vanita and the Leadership Conference and others to say, no, advocates, you trust us that we can build this network to then go execute the census. That's I think work that we could help take on.
And also, I would just add, our state and local leaders should also be advocates for appropriations, right? Because they are, as the Congresswoman just said, local communities are going to suffer if, and state and local leaders have a direct interest in making sure that their constituents and their communities are accurately and fairly counted. And so we should also be doing outreach to them and saying, you ask your federal representative to make sure that there is an appropriate allocation of funds. And so they are an important target as well. In California, for instance, the state of California has stepped up to put in money to help fill the void. Now, not all states are going to be able to do that. That's not ideal. We don't want to be there. We think the federal government should be putting the money that is needed to ensure a fair and accurate count. But there's also that ability for states to step in because they know that they have a direct kind of, they're very on every front, on healthcare, schools, and everything else. They need to see a fair and accurate count to make sure that local institutions are fairly funded too.
All right. We'll take our next question. I invite everybody to tweet that the 2020 census is a civil rights issue we should all be paying attention to. So if we have yet to tweet that today, please do. The hashtag is #CBCFALC17. It will pop up in the feed for everybody. And also tweet that it was Congresswoman Marsha Fudge that convened this conversation. All right, sir, what is your question?
Part of my question is going to be answered when I come up, I think, and sign on the list. But what I want to know is, if I, as committee of one in the organizations that I belong to in my church and all, where do I get the information for organizing around what we're talking about here? I need some concrete, I hear what you're saying here, but something on paper that I can say, here's the list of things that we need to do around the census right now. So where can I get that?
My colleague, Secura Cook from the Leadership Conference, has got information and handouts, and I would encourage any of you, as I said, come up after and put your name down. We will get you resources for that.
Okay, thank you. Second question, third question. Skip the second. So what if we believe in our community that our count is wrong? What do we do? What can one do in their community? They say, you got whatever number in this community. You said, that is absolutely not correct. So where do we go? What's the mechanism for challenging the count in any given situation?
That is a great question. What do we do if the count is wrong, or we believe the count is wrong? Is there anything we can't do?
So there's a few things you can do. The first one is starting right now, and it's called the Local Update of Census Addresses, and that's a program where the Census Bureau will send the address list they have out to any government that wants to participate. And when I left, they had an all-time record of governments that were signing up, and this is the chance to work with your local government to make sure that they review the address list, because a good census starts with a good complete address list. As part of the census process, there is a period that they call a count review, which you are allowed to review the count and suggest changes. Not every challenge to a count review is accepted. They ask for evidence and things like that. But the best way to get a good count is not to wait, but to really, really mobilize in advance of the census, like they were saying, and get a good count to start with.
Just one. The reason I ask that question is because I hear sometimes in the community that, well, we have X number of citizens in this community, but then when the census counts come out, there's a totally different number that's far off. And that's why I raised that question. There's some suspicions about it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent question. Yes, ma'am. What is your question?
My name is Lauren Zayu, and my question is that looking at the rapid growth in urban areas and the fact that this count only happens every 10 years, is there a way to petition your local or state or federal officials and representatives for additional funding?
Thank you.
Keeping in mind, like, if they're growing, I mean, you're going off the count 7 years ago. Some of these cities, I mean, that's like mad behind.
Exactly.
Do you want to take it, start?
Well, there are ways to petition it all the time about census data. So there's a process in place. The census puts out population estimates every year, which carries the previous census forward, and those are used for certain allocations. And there's a challenge process associated with that. Again, these processes, though, aren't they're not a real solution because it's hard to challenge. I'll just say that. The best thing is to advocate for a good census.
Don't feel bleak, everybody.
No. Look,
we're gonna do what we need to do.
The work is now.
The work is right now.
So we need to just get to work.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Kara Turrentine from Tennessee. I wanted to ask, with the shortfall in funding for the census, are states able to shorten that gap or close that gap on their own if they wanted to put funding in their state budgets? Or can cities or mayors put funding in their budgets for census in terms of people on the ground? And is that another lever that local community groups can pull going into next year's budget to ask for funding to support that?
So I would say that the answer is yes, but the goal right now, though, is to get the federal government and Congress to allocate the appropriate funds that they have the wherewithal and resources to do, but are not doing. So I feel like right now the target needs to be that, but there are states, as I mentioned, like California, that are stepping up state funding into the census infrastructure. And so there, once the kind of dust settles on where congressional appropriations are, there is going to be a need to push and organize at the state level to get states to put resources into ensuring that there's a fair and accurate count. And so absolutely, they need to be energized and engaged. State and local leaders need to be energized and engaged. I think mayors have a huge stake in this. I mean, it's at every level. Elected officials have an enormous stake in making sure that there's adequate funding so that down the road their communities get the resources that they deserve.
And traditionally, mayors have played a really aggressive role in their cities, both in the advocacy and the presence of the census and making sure, because there's a lot that mayors can do with public service announcements and press and, making sure that the communities that they know and that they are already familiar with are involved and like making sure enumerators know where to go. Mayors have traditionally played a really important role in this, and I totally agree with Vanita. Right now, mayors...
And then I wanted to ask if you could walk down the timeline again from now to 2020 in terms of when appropriations would happen, when that vote needs to happen, up through the census so people can kind of understand the timeline. And then the second thing I wanted to ask is, what do you think the current immigration conversation now and how that might impact 2020 in terms of, people of color, Latinos, Hispanic people not participating?
So can we go with the second question first? So let's answer that one first.
Well, we have already seen a decline. The fear is increasing, particularly in the Latino community and the immigrant community. I mean, you have, and I was just meeting with a group in Colorado that is right now organizing the Latino community in Colorado. And they are already seeing a drop-off on, other indicators of immigrant communities working with government. For example, like the reporting of domestic violence is down. The requests for government services is down. You're seeing, press reports of like ICE agents going to court and, ready to grab someone and deport them if they are convicted of a crime, right? I mean, the fear factor in the immigrant community is really high. And this particular group that I was meeting with, that, what they would do is go organize the immigrant community to fill out the census. And they have halted their outreach because they want to work with the census first and make sure that they can go into the communities that they know and say, it's okay, you can trust us, fill out this form. And so that fear factor that has gone up, I think, at least in our anecdotal, as my old boss, Leader Pelosi, says, the plural of anecdote is not data. So I don't want to, extrapolate this farther than it needs to be. But in our anecdotal experience, the organizers in the Latino community are backing off, at least right now. Now, Vanita is doing amazing work to bring that all back and rebuild that trust and start those networks. But I think in my limited experience so far, yes, there is an additional layer of trust and concern that we have in immigrant communities because of what has the ethos of the last couple of months.
And to piggyback on that, the real question is, frankly, I don't think we can trust the president of the United States, the current president. We can't trust him and some of his people. But can we trust the census? Can we trust the people who are currently at the Census Bureau? Because I know a lot of these folks are career individuals that want to ensure that the process is carried out well. So we can't trust the president, but can we trust the Census Bureau?
Oh.
Make us all feel better.
No, of course you can.
Okay.
No,
reassuring.
I worked at the Census Bureau for 27 years and went to the private sector. I came back as a political. The overwhelming ethos at the Census Bureau is to produce high quality data and to protect the information of the individuals and businesses that respond to the Census Bureau. I mean, if the Census Bureau career staff were asked to do something that wasn't right, you would know about it. I mean, there would be lots of people resigning, and it would be a very public thing. So and the fact that you don't see that right now indicates that the census has not been asked to do anything like that.
And there are a number of organizations that are doing really powerful organizing and planning around, and we have to be careful because while we don't want to create or foment fear such that we're creating our own undercount problems, right? Mm-hmm. So the census is really important. There are a lot of Latino and other immigrant groups that are very engaged on the organizing. They obviously understand that they need to tamp down the fear and make sure that communities because even undocumented folks, they need to be counted too, because that's municipal resources as well. So we've got to...
Yes, undocumented people pay taxes.
That's right. And so there's a lot of good work afoot on that, but it's obviously a really important dynamic that we need to be concerned about.
It was about the timeline. So wait, we're going to wait before we walk through the timeline. I'm going to have my gentleman here. This will be the last question. We will answer this question, and then the last thing we'll do is walk through the timeline. And then remember, folks, if you would like to get engaged and involved and get on these lists, please come and sign up right here with Ms. Vanita Gupta. Sir, you had the last question.
Speaking of census, in 1872, the first census following the Civil War was to force a provision of the Constitution that has never been enforced. It was called the Reduction of Representation Act. Why do we accept presidential electors on a winner-take-all basis that enforces the original intent of the Electoral College to give disproportionate representation to a Southern white minority in the election of the chief executive over the intent of the Reconstruction Statute of 1872 census, which was to allocate our electors on a proportional basis by reducing state representation for the disfranchised citizen right to vote. Why do we accept states that award on a winner-take-all basis and states that don't have any winner-take-all stature, and not on the fast means of allocation, which is proportional? Michigan is one, Wisconsin is one, and Pennsylvania is one, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. There are 11 states that award on a winner-take basis that don't have a winner-take-all stature. If they did it in abeyance to the second section of the 14th Amendment, Hillary would be president. Thus, I want you to understand that President Trump is president by virtue of our willful ignorance and denial and not enforcing the second section of the 14th Amendment and how presidential electors should be awarded in the absence of a winner-take-all statute. Gordon versus the National Archives and Records Administration.
Well, come on. So I think So I think there's a lot here. I mean, we could also have a whole nother panel and long conversation about the Electoral College and these various different statutes and places of our Constitution, and do we need Electoral College reform, and how does the Electoral College and the way that it's set up permeates every single thing that we do. But I think what I take from this, and I think I'm going to have the last comment before someone else will, I think we'll have Vanita walk us through the timeline, Vanita and former Director Thompson. I think what we should take from this today is that there are many, many, many fights that we have to be engaged in. We got to be able to walk, chew gum, and run at the same time. Jog, if you will. But I think the census is something we cannot allow to go unchecked, untalked about in our communities. We have to actively and forcefully engage on this issue, because if we don't, nobody else is. No one is talking about or thinking about the census right now. Congresswoman Marsha Fudge is. But the rest of us need to be as forcefully engaged on this just as she and her office is, because this is, in fact, a civil rights issue. So with that, what's this timeline? Where are we? How do we get to where we're going?
So I'll start, and then others should follow. But the fight for appropriations and funding is right now. And the Congresswoman can talk about that better than I can, but it's the CR and the appropriations fight is happening right now. And so we are moving and doing a lot of work on the policy side, but that's where engagement, calling your members of Congress, getting in touch with your state and local leaders to urge them, your mayors, to call their members of Congress to make sure that this is an all-hands-on-deck approach, because we've got a couple of months on this, and we've got to get it done right now. And that's where that piece of it is. The get out the count phase and organizing in our local communities, we need to start that right now. It is going to absolutely kick off in earnest in the start of the new year, and that's where we're going to need an all-hands-on-deck approach in all of our communities. And again, feel free to reach out. I've got my pad here, but I want, if people, we need a maximum engagement to get this done.
And Director, when do people actually start being counted?
Census Day is April 1st, 2020. But don't wait till then. I do have to say that the Leadership Conference is really doing a wonderful job of marshaling the resources and fighting the fight to get more funding for the census. I don't know that anybody could be doing it any better.
Kelly?
I was just going to add a comment. There's been some questions and comments about why isn't anyone talking about this and what can we do to get attention. We are, I deal mostly with redistricting, and the census is a major input into redistricting. My new boss, former Attorney General Eric Holder, he said jokingly when we launched our organization that his job was to make redistricting sexy again. Not again, but just make it sexy for the first time. Part of what we're seeing is that there is a huge awareness of redistricting and gerrymandering now, more than there has ever been, because people now see the impact of gerrymandering and the impact of redistricting on our democracy, on the problem, on the system being broken. And it has created this awareness and this concern about something as boring and confusing as redistricting. I think the same thing could happen on the census, where if we all start now to really educate and talk about the significance of it and the impact of it if it doesn't go well, that could help elevate, and with leaders like Congresswoman Fudge and former Attorney General Eric Holder and others that can really lead this conversation to say, y'all, if we don't pay attention to this, here's what the impact is going to be. At least in the redistricting space, we've seen that understanding of how crucial it is has raised awareness, and now there's a kind of understanding of something as notably technical as redistricting, which is as the census, which is redistricting, for whatever that's worth.
You all give this panel a round of applause. I feel like we learned so much in such a short amount of time, and I feel like I want to run out of here and scream to the mountaintops that we need to be doing something about this 2020 census right now. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your moderator. Please give a warm round of applause to Congresswoman Marsha Fudge, and she will close us out.
Listen, now you all see why I love Simone. Listen, I knew that it was a risk to do census. I really did, because people don't even understand why it's important, especially now. And this also is the busiest ALC hour probably in the whole weekend, and I knew it was a risk, but it was important. We are live streaming this. So all of the people who are watching or listening, thank you, because I think the more people that hear it, even if you couldn't be here, you will start to think about why it is important and why it affects you. You know, so often we don't do things unless they affect us personally. This affects every single American personally. So it was worth the risk to me. Because I don't want us to be 2 years from now with our hair on fire, trying to understand why didn't somebody tell me 2 years ago. So I want to thank you all so very, very much. I think that the information was just top notch. I'm going to do this again next year.
Yes.
And so maybe next year people will start to be more concerned and more involved. They don't realize that the census affects almost every single part of our lives. It really is extremely important. So I want to thank the panelists again. I want to thank Simone. I want to thank the other panelists. Thank you so very, very much. And next year, I expect for the room to be full.
There we go.
Thanks, everybody.